A mother German shepherd lay completely still upon the snow-blanketed porch, her form rigid against the biting cold. Two small puppies huddled against her, desperate for a warmth that was fading into the frost. The wind wailed through the pines, a mournful sound that carried their fragile, desperate cries. It was a sound lost to the wilderness, a plea that should have gone unanswered. Yet inside the nearby cabin, a retired Navy SEAL was torn from the grip of another nightmare. As he swung the door open, the war raging in his soul collided with a new battlefield, a silent, desperate struggle between life and the unforgiving cold. The choice he made in that moment would alter the course of 4 lives forever, proving to the world that even a shattered soldier can become the miracle someone is praying for. But before we dive into this story, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Let me know your country in the comments. The snow began its descent at dawn, and by the time darkness fell, it had devoured the landscape completely. Deep in the isolated forests of northern Montana, winter was no mere season. It was an absolute ruler. Its touch brought an unnerving silence to everything. The very air grew dense with frost, and the towering stoic pines seemed to surrender, bowing under its immense weight. Miles from any sign of civilization nestled in this vast emptiness stood a solitary wooden cabin. A single light flickered from within a faint beacon against the infinite white. Inside, Logan Hayes watched the last embers of a dying fire. The only sound to pierce the profound quiet was the soft hiss of ice melting on the chimney. He was 38 years old. His body was a testament to years of grueling discipline and immense hardship. Strands of silver threaded through the dark brown hair at his temples, catching the faint orange light of the flames. A meticulously trimmed beard framed a jawline so sharp it seemed chiseled from granite. A faded scar traced a line across his left cheek. A silent story, while another remained concealed just beneath the collar of his shirt. It snaked down his shoulder, a physical reminder of a war he refused to speak of. In his sharp, weary blue-gray eyes, the dying embers of the fire mirrored his own. They were the eyes of a soul that had witnessed horrors and found little rest since. After his time with the Navy SEALs, Logan had sought to replace the echo of gunfire with the profound silence of the wilderness. This small cabin nestled between ridges and fir trees near Flathead Lake was meant to be both his sanctuary and his self-imposed exile. He believed he had come seeking peace, but in the encroaching darkness, peace often felt indistinguishable from crushing loneliness. Outside, the storm raged with a gathering fury. The wind shrieked like a predator clawing at the cabin walls, its ghostly howl seeping through every crack and rattling the shutters with a raw, untamed fury. Logan sank deeper into his chair, his hand instinctively tracing the ghost of an old wound in his leg, a wound that time refused to fully mend. Each storm was a cruel reminder, waking the ache with a cold, sharp breath that mirrored the mountain air. His gaze was lost in the dying embers, a dance of fading light and shadow, when a whisper of a sound cut through the storm's roar. It was a sound so fragile, so close to nothing, it almost vanished in the gale, a delicate, insistent scratching. He dismissed it at first, a trick of the settling wood. But it came again, softer this time, yet undeniably deliberate, the faint scrape of claws against wood. A deep line creased Logan's brow as the sound persisted, a scrape followed by a faint, desperate whimper. He was on his feet in an instant, a silent, fluid motion born of instinct, not thought. The years had only sharpened the edges of his reflexes, honing them into something quieter, more profound. His hand closed around the heavy flashlight on the table, the cold metal a stark reality against his skin as he moved toward the door. For a single stretched heartbeat, a knot of unease tightened in his chest. Out here, the unknown was rarely a friend, yet something in the cadence of that scratching, in its desperate plea, broke through his hardened caution. It was weak, rhythmic, pleading. Taking a steadying breath, he unlatched the door, and the world outside erupted in a blinding fury of white. A tidal wave of snow crashed into the warmth of the cabin, driven by a wind so brutal it seized the air from his lungs. Logan shielded his eyes, squinting into the chaos, and braced himself against the storm, stepping onto the porch. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the swirling darkness, and then it stopped, frozen on something at his feet. There, huddled by the steps, was a sorrowful shape, nearly swallowed by a thick, unmoving crust of snow. For a moment he saw only a mound of ice, a forgotten relic of the storm. But then his light caught the faintest glint of frost-covered fur, patches of black and tan, rigid with ice. He knelt slowly, the crunch of his boots the only sound besides the wind. It was a dog, a German shepherd, once large and strong, now heartbreakingly thin, the faint outline of her ribs a testament to her struggle. Her breath was a series of shallow, vaporous bursts, each one a fragile tremor against the bitter cold. Tucked beneath her, pressed into the last of her warmth, were two impossibly small puppies, their tiny forms nearly still. The raw, desperate sight stole the breath from his chest. Just then, the mother's eyes fluttered open, deep, amber pools of exhaustion and fear. But beneath the pain was a profound desperation. Her ears twitched a faint acknowledgement, but there was no growl, no threat. She simply held his gaze, a silent, soul-bearing plea, caught between terror and submission. "Christ!" Logan breathed his words, turning to mist. His eyes swept the desolate landscape. Not a single footprint, no sign of tire tracks, only an endless blanket of snow disappearing into the blackness. It was clear they'd been left here hours before. In a storm like this, every passing minute was a fight between survival and the grave. He moved the flashlight's beam closer. The puppies were still alive, their tiny bodies shaking fur stiff with frost. One whimpered a fragile sound that struck him with the force of a gunshot. A knot formed in his chest. From a dormant, empty place within him, something ancient began to stir the part of his soul that remembered the instinct to protect. He knelt in the snow, his voice a low, steady murmur, the very same tone he'd once used to soothe the fears of wounded men on the battlefield. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." The German shepherd's eyes blinked open, slow and weary, her body rigid but still. Her breathing grew faint. Logan recognized that look. He'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers on the front lines, men who had fought until they were completely spent with nothing more to give. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Don't you give up." He shed his heavy coat, draping it carefully over the mother and her litter. The cold struck him immediately, a piercing chill that cut right through his sweater, but he pushed the feeling aside. He gently worked his hands underneath her frozen body. Her fur was stiff with ice. A weak sound escaped her throat, half growl, half plea, but she offered no resistance. Her pups burrowed closer, desperate for any lingering warmth. As he began to lift them, it felt as if the world itself went silent. The weight was minimal, barely 20 pounds of frozen, breathing life, yet it felt more substantial than any burden he had shouldered in years. He rose to his feet, the snow a vortex around him, and pivoted back toward the sanctuary of his cabin. Through the blinding squall, the distant silhouette of another house appeared, a single light flickering against the storm. It was the home of Martha Green, his only neighbor for half a mile. Martha, at 68, had been a widow for almost 10 years. Her silver hair always meticulously gathered in a bun, and she had eyes that missed nothing. On this particular night, she was standing at her window, clutching her shawl tightly, observing the blizzard entomb the world in white. Then she saw the weak beam of Logan's flashlight slicing through the gloom, and she frowned. "That man," she murmured under her breath, a clear note of concern weaving through her words. From a distance she had witnessed his darkest moments, the hollow way he'd stare at the horizon, the way thunder made him flinch as if it were the crack of a rifle. She prayed that the war had finally relinquished its hold on him. Tonight, as the wind screamed, a desperate prayer escaped her lips. "Lord, whatever you have delivered to his door, please give him the courage to open it." Back on the porch, Logan shifted the fragile weight in his arms. The dogs were unnervingly still, For a heartbeat, he hesitated, the soldier in him, weighing the threat against an overwhelming instinct. But the decision was made the moment the door swung inward. He looked down one last time at the mother's face. Her eyelids were beginning to droop, but her chest still fought for air, shallow and stubborn. "Hang on," he whispered. "You've made it this far. I'm not about to let you die on my porch." He stepped over the threshold, kicking the door shut behind him. The cabin's warmth met them like a tender embrace. He knelt by the hearth, gently lowering the mother and her pups onto an old wool blanket beside the fire. Wisps of steam rose as the heat began to thaw their frozen fur. The puppies let out faint whimpers, tiny sounds that fractured a silence that had long dominated the space. Logan held his own hands toward the fire, feeling the painful sting of returning life. His breath was ragged, his heart pounding not from effort but from something else entirely, a strange and fragile sense of purpose. He watched the dogs, how the flames flickered across their still bodies, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he sensed a pulse of life in the cabin that was not just his own. He sat back on his heels, his eyes riveted on the mother's side, willing her chest to rise one more time. The flames danced in her amber eyes as she moved faintly, a single paw twitching. She was alive by a thread, but alive. Logan finally exhaled, the immense tension releasing its grip on him. He reached for another blanket, covering them with deliberate care, his hands now steady. The storm continued its assault outside, battering the walls, but inside, the fire grew brighter, casting long, living shadows that danced across the room. And then, almost unconsciously, he smiled, a small, weary but genuine smile. "You're safe now," he murmured. Then he knelt again, ever so gently. He gathered the dogs into his embrace. The mother's form was heavy pups clinging tightly as he stood. Each step brought them toward the firelight. It promised warmth, it promised life. Outside, the snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the world in silence. But within the cabin's walls, as the door latched shut and the storm consumed his footprints, something long dormant within his soul began to wake. By morning, the storm had not relented. It howled with a deep, endless fury, pressing on the cabin walls like a caged beast. A thick layer of frost had blinded the windows, blurring the world outside into pure white. The fire crackled feebly inside its light, casting uneasy shadows across the floor. Logan was knelt by the hearth, his hands raw and aching from the cold, moving with a silent urgency. The 3 dogs, 1 mother, and 2 tiny pups rested on a blanket by the fire. Her fur, once a coarse and frozen mat, now steamed softly as the warmth sank deep inside. Her chest hitched in a shallow, unsteady rhythm. Logan dipped a soft cloth into a bowl of warm water, wrung it out, then gently stroked her flank, melting the final shards of ice that clung to her fur. "Come on now, girl," he whispered, his voice low, yet resolute. "You've survived worse than this, I know it." She was still, but then her eyes opened. They were amber, watchful, and filled with a raw instinct to protect. Her gaze tracked his every single move, not with fear, but a cautious wonder. As he moved to check the pups, her gaze softened, watching the 2 small forms huddled for warmth, their tiny frames shuddering with the effort to live. One let out a faint whimper, its nose pushing at its mother. The sound arrested Logan's movement. It was the first real sign of life beyond her breathing. "That's it," he breathed, putting the cloth aside. "Stay with me." He grabbed an old wool blanket from the chair, carefully wrapping it around the pups. Their fur was still damp, but finally warm. As he held them close to the fire, he felt the fragile flutter of their hearts against his palm. For just a moment, something deep inside him, some frozen, long-abandoned part of his soul stirred awake. On the table behind him, his coffee had long since gone cold. He hadn't even considered it. His entire being was consumed by the delicate lives breathing before him. The steady ritual of their care, the gentle wiping, the constant checks, the patient rewarming, instilled a purpose in his hands he hadn't felt in ages. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, His mind drifted back to his unit, to the impossible choices where saving one life meant gambling with 6 others to the faces of those who never returned. A knot formed in his throat, but his gaze remained locked on the flames. "You will not die here," he whispered fiercely. "Not while I'm here." Then a sharp crack outside as a branch surrendered to the snow, and a sound, a faint rap, carried on the wind. Logan went still. It echoed again, more deliberate this time. 3 solid knocks against the old wooden door. He turned, conflict flashing in his eyes. Almost no one ever ventured this deep into the forest, certainly not in a storm like this. Still he rose and moved toward the door. His steps measured not to startle the mother dog. Her head lifted a fragile movement, her ears trembling at the strange sound. As Logan pulled the door open, a violent gust of wind and snow burst into the room, followed by a small, tough figure, bundled in a heavy brown coat, a wool scarf shielding her face. Martha Green stood on his threshold, clutching a covered pot tightly in both hands. Snow clung to her silver hair and settled into the lines etched on her weathered face. Her cheeks were chapped by the brutal cold, yet her kind gray eyes shone with immense relief upon seeing him. "Oh, dear God, Logan." She breathed, her voice a gentle current strong enough to push back the storm. "You still have a fire going in there? I was worried you'd frozen solid along with everything else." Logan stepped back, gesturing her inside. "You shouldn't be out in this, Martha!" She brushed off his concern with a wave of her hand, stepping in and stomping the snow from her boots. "Do you really think a little blizzard can keep me away? I brought you soup. I figured you might have forgotten the taste of a hot meal." Her tone was playful, but her gaze was already sweeping the small cabin. Then her eyes landed on the bundle by the hearth, and her words caught in her throat. "Oh. Oh my." She carefully set the pot on the table and drifted closer, her hand pressed against her heart in disbelief. "Are those German shepherds?" Logan's reply was barely a whisper. "I found them just outside the porch, last night." Martha lowered herself with a deliberate slowness, her knees groaning a familiar protest. She was a small woman, yet forged from an unyielding strength, the kind of woman who had faced storms far fiercer than the one raging outside. She had laid a husband to rest, raised 2 sons now distant by miles, and had discovered solace in the steady rhythms of life, like baking bread or breathing life back into others with her quiet kindness. "Oh, you poor little souls." She breathed, her hand hovering in the air as the mother's head rose to meet her gaze. There was no growl, only a silent watchfulness, a cautious calm. "And you, my sweet girl," she murmured. "You are so very brave." Logan knelt beside her once more, drawing the rough towel along the dog's flank. "She's still fighting," he said, his voice low. "The pups are too." "Just barely." Martha rose with a heavy grace, brushing away a single tear that had traced a path down her weathered cheek. "You again?" she said, her voice a soft reproach. "Always you and your lost causes. First the hawk with its shattered wing, then that fox in the dead of winter, and now this." He offered a nearly imperceptible shrug, his gaze fixed on this floor. "They knock on my door. I answer." Her expression softened with understanding, but her mouth tightened into a firm line. "You're still trying to save every broken thing, Logan Hayes, even when you believe you've given up on the world itself." The silence that followed was his only answer. The only sounds were the hiss and crackle of the fire and the fragile whimpers of the newborn pups. Martha turned her back, moving toward the table, lifting the heavy lid from the pot she'd carried through the storm. A healing aroma of chicken and herbs slowly enveloped the small cabin. She ladled a steaming bowl and set it beside him. "Eat, before you collapse right where you stand. You look half-starved yourself." He hesitated for only a moment, then gave a slow nod, the faintest ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Thank you." As he ate, Martha retrieved a smaller pot, which she filled with warmed milk before kneeling once more by the makeshift bed. She carefully dipped a clean strip of cloth, coaxing a few precious drops into each tiny mouth. The first one licked a flicker of instinct, then the second. A genuine smile finally touched her face. "There now," she whispered, a sound of pure relief. "That's the way." The warmth within the cabin seemed to deepen, pushing back the cold as the storm outside faded to a distant, mournful hum. The fire burned brighter, its flames dancing against the logs in a steady rhythm. Logan set his empty bowl aside, his features stark and shadowed in the firelight. "If you hadn't come, I don't think they would have made it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Martha simply shook her head. "If you hadn't opened your door, son, they never would have had a chance at all." They sat together in the quiet, a shared silence filling the space between them. Their eyes were fixed on the mother dog. A steadier rhythm had returned to her breathing, her tense frame gradually giving way to ease. A single paw reached out, drawn to the warmth, and then for the very first time since her rescue, she surrendered to sleep. Martha stood wrapping her coat around herself against the cold. "I'll be back to check on you tomorrow," she promised, her tone gentler now. "Keep that fire going," she warned, "and don't you dare go out either." The click of the door brought back the silence. Yet this was a different quiet. It was alive. Logan's attention returned to the hearth, mesmerized by the gentle rise and fall of 3 tiny chests, their breaths a counterpoint to the dancing flames, the terror, the storm, the long, hollow nights. All of it seemed to recede, dissolving into the fragile, flickering glow of the firelight. A sudden pop from the fire sent a lone spark spiraling upward. Logan settled back in his chair, feeling a deep warmth slowly seep back into his chilled bones. The mother's breathing deepened into slumber. The pups burrowed even closer. Outside, the wind howled on, but within the cabin walls, something new had taken root. A faint yet steady heartbeat, one that wasn't only the dog's. The man who believed he had nothing left to fight for remained by the fire, his hand resting near their small, sleeping forms. Beyond those walls, the world was locked in ice, but inside this small, humble room, life had found its way back. And as the flames swayed, the distinction between merely surviving and truly healing began to quietly blur. Dawn arrived hesitantly over the mountains. A delicate gray light filtered through the ice-laced panes, as soft and chilling as a whisper. The fury of the storm had passed, leaving in its wake a silence so profound it felt sacred. A heavy blanket of snow draped the trees, and the sky loomed low, ashen and pale. Within the cabin, a lingering warmth held on like a cherished memory, tinged with the subtle scent of the woods, damp fur and something else. The fragile scent of life returning. Logan shifted in the old wooden chair where he'd passed the night. His body protested with the familiar ache of a restless sleep, but this time the pain felt somehow gentler, less of a punishment. The fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers, their soft, crackling sound coaxing him from the edges of sleep. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, his gaze turning towards the blanket by the hearth. And the sight that met him drew a slow, astonished breath. A weary smile touched his lips. The mother dog, fragile but alert, lay curled in a protective crescent around her 2 puppies. Their tiny bodies stirred faintly, with every breath pressed deeply into the warmth of her chest. For the first time since he'd pulled them from the storm, the pups were no longer trembling. The color had returned to their little ears, their fur now dry and shimmering in the fire's amber glow. One of them let out a soft squeak, stretching a paw, then burrowed even deeper against its mother's side. Logan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, his voice hushed and reverent. "You made it." The German shepherd turned her head to him, her fierce amber eyes shining with a new clarity. She studied him in the silence, her ears twitching, as if weighing the truth of his heart. Logan didn't move a muscle, letting her take his measure. In that quiet gaze, something passed between them. Not for trust, not yet, but an unspoken truce. He reached out his hand slowly, palm open. The dog sniffed the air, then nudged her muzzle forward. Her nose touched his fingers, a contact as light as a whisper. And then to his shock, her tongue flickered out, tracing a single trembling line on the back of his hand. Gratitude, acceptance. He released a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Grace," he murmured. "That's your name." The word felt right. There was grace in her astonishing endurance, a grace in the simple, powerful fact that she had not surrendered even when everything had been turned against her. He glanced at the two pups. One, slightly larger, had a dark streak of fur down its back and the alert posture of a sentinel even while asleep. "Scout," he said softly. "You look like you're ready for an adventure." The smaller one, a gentle tangle of gold and black, rested its head on its sibling's paw. "And you, Luna, you've already got your mother's wise eyes." He sat back, repeating their names into the quiet of the room, as if the sound of them could make their survival permanent. Grace Scout Luna. The cabin's air grew warmer as the fire breathed anew. Logan fed it another log, the sparks spiraling upward like golden ghosts. His own hands moved with a steadiness that felt foreign. He hadn't felt this kind of quiet, absolute purpose, a familiar duty he hadn't felt since the service where lives hinged on his composure under fire. This felt smaller, more intimate, but the weight of it was just as real. He rose to his feet, stretching a weary back as his eyes found the window. The onslaught of snow had finally stopped, but the world outside lay draped in a silent, undisturbed blanket. The stillness was a chilling echo of the aftermath of battle when the world went quiet, and all that remained was the grim accounting of who was left. He wrenched his gaze away before the memory could pull him under. From a kitchen shelf, he pulled a dented tin bowl, filled it with clean water, and carefully set it down near the dogs. Grace sniffed it before lapping at the water, her motion still exhausted but steady. Her pups stirred following their mother's lead, their wobbly first steps ending in soft collapses against her body. A low chuckle escaped Logan's lips, a sound he hadn't recognized as his own in months. "Easy, you two," he murmured. "Take your time. You have a lifetime to learn how to stand on your own." When the knock sounded at the door, it wasn't loud. Just a soft, deliberate rap 3 times. Logan turned somehow, already expecting it was Martha. He swung the door open to find her there, wrapped in her thick wool coat, snow still dusting her boots. The bitter cold had flushed her cheeks pink, and a knitted hat sat crookedly on her head. "Morning, soldier," she said, lifting a small basket. "Are you awake, or should I come back after you're done saving the world for the day?" He allowed a faint smirk. "You're persistent. Martha!" "Someone's got to make sure you don't fade away in here." She brushed the last of the snow from her coat and stepped over the threshold, the warm scent of cinnamon and baked bread trailing behind her. "Brought breakfast. I figured you'd forgotten that people need to eat in the morning." Her eyes immediately locked on the fireplace. "Well, I'll be," she breathed, setting the basket on his table. "They're still here. Barely, but yes," Logan answered, his voice softening. "Grace Scout and Luna." "Grace," Martha whispered, her smile blooming. "You gave her a name?" "She earned it," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Martha crouched, her knees cracking in protest. "You're a true beauty, Grace," she murmured to the dog, who watched her with caution, but didn't shy away. "And your little ones? Good heavens, they're so fragile." Her hand slipped into her coat pocket, emerging with a piece of cooked chicken carefully wrapped in a napkin. "Here, sweet girl," she whispered. "You need your strength." Grace cautiously sniffed the offering, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. She delicately took the morsel from Martha's hand. The older woman then looked up at Logan, her gray eyes radiating a profound warmth. "See, an animal always recognizes a kind soul." Logan simply nodded silent. He watched them, a quiet, surprising sense of peace settling over him. After a few moments passed, Martha rose with a weary groan, pressing a hand to the small of her back. "I ought to get going before that road turns to sheer ice," she murmured. "But Logan," You make me a list of what you need dog food medicine. Blackett, whatever it is. I'll pick it all up when I make my town run this weekend. He slowly shook his head. You don't have to do that. I know I don't, she interrupted softly, her voice unwavering. And that's precisely why I'm going to. A small, yet genuine smile touched his lips. Thank you, Martha. After she departed, a heavy silence fell upon the cabin once more. He stood at the window watching her form recede down the snow-covered trail, her figure dwindling in the distance until she was gone, leaving only faint footprints behind. Only then did he turn his attention back to the dogs. Grace had moved nearer the hearth, her pups tucked securely against her. The firelight danced in her eyes, catching a watchful glint, a look both soft and vigilant. Logan knelt beside them, placing his hand gently on the wooden floor near her paws. You have your family back, he whispered. A beat of silence passed before he added, and maybe I do too. Beyond the walls, the snow on the eaves had begun to yield, each drop a steady beat upon the frozen earth. The rhythm was constant, like the first ticks of a clock long dormant, now starting its count anew. Logan remained by the window as morning light slowly filled the world, the landscape outside brightening in subtle increments. He felt a sensation that had become foreign to him, a tranquility that seeped past flesh and bone, settling somewhere deeper than recollection. Just behind him, Grace was lost in slumber, her pups' breaths rising and falling in a soft, unified rhythm. The fire cast a gentle, flickering glow. And for the first time since winter's icy grip took hold, the cabin no longer felt like a refuge of isolation. It felt like a home. And as the sun finally kissed the snow, Logan knew he was no longer alone. The last of the winter's snow was finally surrendering, turning the once frozen landscape into a blinding sheet of glass under the new spring sun. The days were stretching out now, and the forest that held the cabin seemed to breathe again. Meltwater whispered through the deep cracks between ancient stones, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and awakening earth. Logan stood just outside his cabin door, the sharp wind pulling at his flannel jacket as his gaze settled on the dogs. Grace moved just ahead of him, her black and tan coat glistening under the sun, her every step a mix of confidence and a deep ingrained caution. Around her, the two pups darted, Scout and Luna tumbling in a clumsy dance through what was left of the snow. Their legs were sturdier now, their barks sharper, filled with a desperate curiosity for every sound the wilderness offered. Logan whistled a low note that cut the air, and both pups froze, ears twitching. That's it, he murmured, crouching low to the ground. Come on back now. Scout came bounding first, all heart his tail a frantic blur, while Luna trailed with a careful grace, her wide eyes absorbing every detail, her paws light on the ground. Grace trotted behind them both, the thin, pale scar around her neck catching a sliver of light. Logan had noticed it again just that morning, a ghostly ring of healed skin buried beneath the darkness of her fur. He knelt beside her, his hand gently brushing her neck, his fingers tracing the uneven ridge left behind. Someone had you chained up, didn't they, girl? He whispered. Grace just looked up at him, her amber eyes calm, holding neither fear nor bitterness. A story lived in her stillness, the kind that never needed to be spoken aloud. Logan let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You never deserved that. He had seen it too many times, in both men and animals, the deep scars left by the cruelty of survival. In Grace, he saw the same quiet resilience he'd witnessed in soldiers who carried invisible wounds long after their physical ones had healed. From deep within the cabin, a faint clang of metal echoed. The kettle had begun to scream. He pushed himself up, wiping damp snow from his jeans, and took a step toward the porch. That was the moment he heard it. 3 soft, deliberate knocks on his cabin door. People didn't come this far into the trees, not even when the roads were clear. A slight furrow crossed his brow as he called out, Just a moment." When he pulled the door open, he fully expected to see Martha, perhaps offering another warm loaf of bread. Instead, a small, fragile figure stood there. A boy no older than 10. The child was swallowed by a coat 2 sizes too large, its sleeves carefully cuffed at his wrists. His knit hat had slumped to one side, and a defiant shock of sandy brown hair peeked out from underneath. His face was ghostly pale from the cold, but his cheeks were deeply flushed, his nose a bright red. A heavy wool scarf nearly erased his chin as he looked up, his bright green eyes a battleground of shyness and sheer determination. "Are you Mr. Hayes?" The boy's voice trembled, a fragile sound nearly lost to the biting wind. "I am," Logan replied cautiously. "What brings you all this way out here?" The boy wavered nervously, wringing his mittened hands together. I live just down the road. My grandma told me. She said you rescued some dogs during the blizzard." His eyes darted past Logan's frame, desperately seeking the faint dancing shadows of movement near the hearth. Can I please see them?" Logan's immediate instinct was a hard refusal. Years of guarded solitude had forged a habit of silence, of keeping the world at a distance. But a raw earnestness in the boy's voice broke through a ghost of the young recruits he once shaped and trained. He stepped back from the doorway. "All right, get in here before you freeze solid." The boy's grin was a sudden, radiant sunrise. He quickly stepped inside, stamping the stubborn snow from his boots. The enveloping warmth of the fire hit him, drawing a soft, involuntary sigh of relief. He tugged off his mittens, revealing thin, chapped hands. "I'm Eli," he said, the words rushing out, as if he feared his courage would abandon him if he paused. "Eli Turner." "It's good to meet you, Eli." Logan gestured toward the fire. "They're right over there." Eli's gaze followed his hand, and his mouth fell open in silent awe. Grace was lying near the fire, her noble head lifting as the boy slowly approached. Scout and Luna stirred at her side, their tails beginning a soft, rhythmic thump against the floor. "They're beautiful," Eli whispered the word full of reverence. He knelt with a gentle caution, extending a hesitant hand. "Hi there." Grace tasted the air, her intelligent eyes studying the boy. Then, having decided he was no threat, she tenderly nudged her nose against his waiting palm. Eli's smile bloomed fully. "She likes me." "Seems to me she's got good instincts," Logan murmured from behind him, his arms crossed over his chest. Eli's gaze shifted to him. "You know, my dad used to say the exact same thing. About dogs, I mean. He believed they could see the truth inside a person better than we ever could." Logan tilted his head, his voice low. "Your dad sounds like he was a very wise man." A profound sadness softened Eli's features. He was a Marine. He didn't make it back from Afghanistan. His voice fractured on the final word, becoming a barely audible whisper. A heavy silence descended upon the cabin, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire. Logan's throat constricted. He found his eyes drawn back to the faint scar on Grace's neck, as if it were an easier sight to bear than the boy's raw grief. "I'm so sorry, kid," he murmured the words, feeling inadequate. Eli simply nodded his hand, continuing to stroke Grace's thick fur. "My mom says I inherited his stubborn streak, but Grandma says I got his heart. I'm never sure which one she thinks is the better part of him." A ghost of a smile touched Logan's lips. "Probably both." The boy's focus shifted, a flicker of curiosity returning to his eyes. "Is it true you were a soldier too?" Logan paused, the question hanging in the air. "Navy SEAL," he finally confirmed. "But that was a long, long time ago." Eli's eyes widened, a complex mix of awe and a solemn understanding. "Then you know," the boy said softly. "You know what it's like, to miss people you can never get back." Logan swallowed against the tightness in his chest. "Yeah," he breathed. "I do." For a long moment, the shared weight of their loss filled the room. Then Eli, with the suddenness of childhood, shattered the solemnity. "Can I name one He asked, his tone hopeful. A genuine chuckle escaped Logan. A little late for that. They've all got names. Eli's shoulders slumped in disappointment, but just then, Luna gently nudged his hand, her warm tongue lapping at his fingers. "What's her name?" "That's Luna," Logan said. "Her brother is Scout, Wes, and their mom is Grace." "Grace." Eli repeated the name a soft echo as he petted her. "That's a really good name." He sat with her in the quiet, his small hands lost in her deep fur until she finally rested her head trustingly on his knee. The boy looked up at Logan, his eyes shining. "But Tor." "She trusts people again." Logan remained against the wall, arms folded, watching the bond form. Maybe we both needed the reminder. Outside, the crisp air carried the rhythmic sound of melting ice dripping from the burdened trees. The sun, now higher in the sky, cast a brilliant glare across the thawing snow. In the distance, Martha's familiar figure emerged on the trail basket in tow. Reaching the porch, she peered through the open doorway, and a warm, knowing smile spread across her face at the tranquil scene within. "It appears you have a visitor," she remarked, placing the basket on the floor. "And the best kind of company," Logan agreed with a nod. "This is Eli. He came to see the dogs." "Well, aren't you a courageous one?" Martha said with a gentle smile. "That path is a sheet of ice today." "I just had to see them," Eli answered shyly. "My grandma told me they were miracles." A soft chuckle escaped Martha, her eyes shifting to Logan. "I have a feeling she was talking about you as well, soldier." He simply shook his head, choosing not to contest it. After Martha departed, Eli lingered for a while, settling cross-legged before the hearth as Luna nestled into his lap. The puppy's small tail thumped with joy as she gently tugged at his scarf. The sound of the boy's laughter cascaded through the cabin, echoing off the wooden rafters, a pure, bright sound in a space that had been silent for far too long. When the moment came to leave, Eli rose with hesitation. "Is it okay if I come back?" he asked, his voice hopeful. A rare smile touched Logan's lips. "You can, just let's keep it between us that I agreed." Eli's face broke into a wide grin, zipping up his coat. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." He turned toward Grace, gently scratching behind her ear. "I'll see you soon, girl." As the boy vanished down the path, Logan stood framed in the doorway, his gaze fixed until the small silhouette dissolved into the tree line. The snow cast back the sunlight, a brilliant, piercing glare. And for the very first time, the brightness didn't cause him to flinch. Instead, it felt warm. He turned, stepping back inside the cabin. Grace had already resettled herself beside the glowing embers, with Scout and Luna nestled tightly against her warmth. Logan lowered himself into his chair, the echo of the boy's laughter still resonating softly in his mind. For so many years, his world had been composed of nothing but shadows and silence. But in this moment, for the very first time, he felt something elemental and true. The faint yet undeniable rhythm of hope. By afternoon, the Montana sky had bled into a shade of pewter, the sort of heavy gray that foretold another approaching storm. The sun, a pale and weary disk, hung low over the tree line, its light straining weakly through the skeletal branches. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, caught in the stillness between a thaw and a hard freeze. Logan emerged from the cabin, his breath crystallizing in the sharp, brittle air. He had made a vow to himself that morning he would split more firewood before the temperature plunged once more. The cold sliced at his exposed skin, but he embraced the sting. Pain, after all, was the one thing that proved he was still alive. He was wrapped in a canvas jacket, a relic from his Navy days, worn at the seams but fiercely loyal. His beard had grown wilder this past week, threaded with a gray that aged him beyond his 38 years. Grace moved beside him, her tail a soft rhythm to his steps. She had finally reclaimed all her strength, her muscles powerful beneath her dense coat, her eyes bright with knowing. Scout and Luna, the two pups, whimpered from the porch as he departed. "Stay," Logan commanded softly, his tone firm yet affectionate. "I won't be long." The trail behind the cabin snaked through a clearing, then plunged down a slope toward the frozen stream. He'd walked this trail hundreds of times. The ice there shone deceptively smooth, hiding the treacherous ground below. He firmed his grip on the axe. He searched for dry wood among snow-dusted logs. A wind began to rise, hissing through the trees, pulling at his coat. He found a fallen pine nearly buried in snow and knelt beside it. The bark cracked beneath his blade, the chopping rhythm steady, nearly meditative. For a moment he was lost in it, the simple, honest labor of cutting solid wood. When he lifted another piece to stack, his boot found a treacherous patch of ice concealed by the snow. The fall was instantaneous. His leg was violently swept from beneath him. His body twisted, crashing hard onto the slope. The axe flew away, sliding into the frost. He tried to break his fall, but his left foot was trapped beneath the fallen pine trunk. A sharp, nauseating crack. Pain was fire. A choked sound tore from his gritted teeth. The wind swallowed his cry. He tried to move, but the trunk held his leg immovable. A cold panic bloomed beneath the surface of his controlled breaths. He yelled once, then twice his voice vanishing into the woods. "Help!" The word echoed, vanishing into the cold. He tried again, his voice much louder. But the strengthening wind tore his cries into nothing. The cold began its cruel and precise invasion. A chilling dampness seeped through his jeans as the snow began to melt beneath him, an ache spreading through his bones like a creeping poison. Logan fell back against the frozen earth, fighting to keep his thoughts from shattering. His training screamed at him to cage his fear, to think before it consumed him whole. "Breathe," he whispered hoarsely. "Just stay calm." He clawed at the tree trunk, attempting to shove it away, but his legs erupted in protest. A wave of pain blurred his vision. The world tilted on its axis, the bleak sky swirling overhead. Back at the cabin, Grace paced anxiously by the window, a storm brewing inside her. Her ears flickered at every howl of the wind. A deep wrongness settled in her soul. She could feel a void where a life should have been. A low growl rumbled in her chest, followed by a sharp, demanding bark that cut through the silence. Scout and Luna raised their heads from the rug, their eyes filled with confusion. Grace's bark echoed again, this time a desperate roar, as she scrambled to the door, her claws tearing at the wood. Across the vast, frozen clearing, Martha Green, a basket of hand-knitted scarves in her arms, was heading for her porch when the sound shattered the quiet. Her silver hair was hidden beneath a wool hat, her breath misting in the frigid air as she moved through the deep snow. But the frantic barking stopped her dead in her tracks. She carefully placed the basket in the snow, her eyes narrowing as she peered toward Logan's cabin. Grace's desperate cries sliced through the silent trees. "Something has happened," Martha breathed the words, turning to Frost. Without another thought, she spun around and plunged down the trail, her boots sinking into the fresh powder. At that very moment, in a small farmhouse just down the road, young Eli sat captivated by the window, sketching intently in a well-loved notebook. His pages were filled with wildlife birds, foxes, and most recently the German shepherds from up the way. His grandmother, a tall and formidable woman named Ruth Turner, often chided him for drawing too much and not worrying enough. But on this day, a knot tightened in the boy's gut as the distant barking reached him on the wind. He snatched his coat and hat, bolting out the door before Ruth could even speak his name. He chased the sound, his breath catching like ice in his throat. The snow rose to his knees in drifts, but it didn't slow him. When he finally caught up to Martha on the path, she was breathless, but her eyes were set with fierce determination. "Eli!" she breathed, a hand flying to her heart. "You heard that, didn't you?" "Yes, ma'am," the boy whispered, his eyes vast with alarm. "It's Grace. Something is terribly wrong." "Then what are we waiting for? Let's go," Martha pressed. Grace intercepted them mid-path, a frantic blur against the snow, her barks sharp and desperate. Crystals of ice clung to her fur, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She skidded to a halt before them, a low, urgent whine escaping her before she pivoted back towards the tree line. "She's telling us to follow," Eli stated, his voice thin. Martha gave a sharp nod, pulling her scarf tighter against the chill. "All right, girl, show us." They plunged into the deep snow, with Grace darting ahead, casting anxious glances back every few moments, ensuring they were still coming. The woods had fallen eerily silent, oppressed by the heavy blanket of approaching night. As they crested the slope behind their cabin, Martha's hand shot to her lips in a stifled gasp. Logan lay half swallowed by the snow beside a massive fallen pine, his face a ghastly white, his breathing faint and shallow. The leg pinned beneath the trunk was bent at a horrifying, unnatural angle. Grace leaped to his side, whining piteously as she licked his cold cheek. "Logan!" Martha screamed, stumbling forward. "Oh, dear Lord Eli, you have to help me." The boy fell to his knees next to her. "He's stirring," he said, his voice trembling uncontrollably. Logan's eyelids fluttered, his gaze struggling to focus. When he finally saw them, a faint, pained grin touched his lips. "Took you long enough," he rasped. "Don't you even dare joke about this!" Martha choked out hot tears, blurring her vision. "Eli, push from that side. Grace, stay back." With a shared cry of effort, they threw their weight against the log. It barely moved. Martha's arms shook violently with the strain. Eli's boots scrambled for purchase on a patch of ice. Grace circled them, frantic, then suddenly began clawing at the snow packed around Logan's leg, digging with a desperate fury, clearing the hard-packed ice from beneath him. "That's it, girl," Martha gasped, breathing hard. "Don't stop." Eli planted his shoulder firmly against the rough bark, pushing with every ounce of his strength. Martha threw her weight in beside him, both of them groaning with the effort. The timber groaned, shifting a fraction of an inch against the frozen earth. "One more time," she yelled. They surged forward again. With a final, unified grunt, the log rolled just enough. Logan cried out, dragging his mangled leg from the trap. He collapsed, groaning in agony and clutching handfuls of snow. Grace molded her body against his, a desperate transfer of warmth into his ice-cold limbs. Martha dropped to her knees beside him, her hands frantically clearing snow from his face. "You're going to be okay," she insisted, her firm words betraying the tremor in her voice. Eli stared up at her, his small face a pale mask of fear. "We have to get him back to the cabin, now." Logan fought to form words, his lips painfully cracked and frozen. You did good," he rasped, the sound torn from his throat. Then his gaze met Grace's. She gently licked his cheek again, her tail giving a faint, hopeful thump against the snow. A broken laugh rattled in his chest, raw and utterly breathless. "Looks like the ones I rescued just returned the favor." They half-carried, half-dragged his dead weight toward the cabin, the firelight flickering in the window like a distant promise of survival. The moment they stumbled across the threshold, a wave of life-giving warmth crashed over their frozen faces. Martha immediately heaved more logs onto the fire as Eli scrambled for blankets. Grace refused to leave Logan's side, curling her body against his, as if to personally shield him from the cold itself. Outside, the wind shrieked across the ridge, a relentless predator, erasing every trace of their desperate journey one by one. But inside, within the sanctuary of the small wooden cabin, life had once again won its defiant battle against the winter. And as Logan finally drifted into the blackness of unconsciousness, he was surrounded by the family that had refused to surrender him. The fury of the storm outside finally began to quiet. Morning light, thin and golden, seeped through the cabin's frosted windows, spreading a gentle warmth across the room that had just hours before been filled with nothing but a cold, heavy silence. The storm had been gone for days, but its memory lingered like a ghost in the half-buried firewood stacked against the door, in the deep, pulsing ache in Logan Hayes' bandaged leg, and in the raw scent of damp pine that clung to the cabin walls. He lay on the couch near the hearth, one leg tightly wrapped from his ankle to his knee. The sharp agony had finally dulled, replaced by a heavy, profound soreness that served as a constant reminder of his own fragility. Grace remained beside him, her chin resting on the couch's edge, her amber eyes locked on his face as her fur shimmered in the firelight, a tapestry of black and tan with subtle golden hues that danced with each breath. She was a statue, moving only to press closer whenever he shifted. Nearby Scout and Luna played. They tumbled in a chaotic pile, their tiny barks swallowed by the thick wool rug, their tails beating a relentless, joyful rhythm, like small, unstoppable engines of life. Logan's gaze remained fixed on the ceiling, his hands clasped over the stillness of his chest. The ceiling beams were rough-hewn and uneven, built by his own hands years ago, when he believed this isolation could mend what the war had shattered inside him. It hadn't. Yet now, with the air thick with the scent of new life, of puppies, pine smoke, and a simmering stew, this place no longer felt like a cage. Impossibly, it felt like a home. The door creaked, and a blade of the cold air sliced through the warmth, followed by the crunch of boots and a voice he recognized. "You're finally awake," Martha said softly, a small basket balanced carefully against her hip. Her silver hair seemed to glow in the firelight, escaping the bun she always hastily tied each morning. She was wrapped in a knitted scarf, the color of wild berries, her cheeks flushed and bright from her walk through the cold. "I was beginning to suspect you'd sleep right through another day of mending." A faint smile touched Logan's lips. "Didn't have much say in it. Doctor's orders." "My orders, you mean?" she teased gently, pushing the door closed behind her. "And yes, I most certainly do." Martha had been a constant presence since the accident, bringing him food, medicine, and a quiet strength that eased the immense weight of his recovery. She moved about the cabin with an unasked-for familiarity, tending to the fire, straightening the small table, a low hum vibrating in her throat. There was never any pity in her gaze when she looked at Logan, only a firm, motherly insistence that he keep fighting. "And the leg?" she asked, setting down her basket. "Still attached," he grunted in reply, trying to adjust his position on the couch. She gave him a look that could melt glaciers. "You'll need that leg if you plan on walking Grace and her pups come spring, so behave." He let out a soft chuckle. "You sound just like a drill sergeant. 68 years of life gives you the right to boss around anyone under 40 soldier." Logan's laughter faded, settling into a small, wistful smile. The word soldier always struck something deep within him, though the pain of it was beginning to dull. Grace's ears twitched at the sound, and she lifted her head, her eyes shifting between the two of them, as if eavesdropping on a dialogue that began long before they were born. Martha started to unpack the provisions from her basket. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the room, mingling with something warm and savory. "Beef stew," she announced softly. "Made it fresh this morning." "You're going to need the nourishment if you want to stop looking so haunted." Logan reached for the bowl she offered, the profound warmth seeping into his very palms. "You don't have to keep doing this every day." "I know," she replied, settling across from him with her own steaming mug of tea. "But I want to. Besides, Grace here would just give me an earful until I did." At the mention of her name, Grace's tail thumped a rhythm against the floor, coaxing a gentle laugh from both of them. For a long while, the cabin was enveloped in quiet comforts. The soft sounds of the pups eating, the hypnotic crackle from the hearth, and the distant mournful whisper of the wind. Martha sipped her tea, her gaze sweeping over the small room. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this place feels different now." Logan raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Alive," she answered. "It used to be. Whenever I stopped by, it